Good evening, dear listener, and welcome to Audio Classic Detective, your home for refined mystery and masterful deduction. Here we revive the golden age of crime fiction where every motive is masked, every alibi tested, and only the keenest minds prevail. So settle in, brew a proper cup of tea, and prepare for clever crimes and even cleverer solutions. The investigation is about to begin. Chapter 1: The Impossible Crime. It was in the second week of September, during one of those heavy airless spells that descend upon London like a suffocating curtain, that the singular case of the paper lanterns came into our lives. Though I had seen Holmes dissect 1,000 enigmas with his usual scalpel-like logic, I can say with confidence that the affair which began on that still, breathless morning in Baker Street was unlike any that preceded it. We had been in something of a lull. The papers were thick with scandal, politics, and speculation of war in the East, but there had been nothing in our corner of the world to stir Holmes from the fog of disinterest. He had spent much of the past week immersed in a translation of obscure Persian poetry, more, I suspect, for the puzzle of its metaphor than any literary affection. It was I who noticed the figure at first. A shadow upon the street, slow and deliberate, pausing before the familiar brass number on our door. The man was slight, dressed in a carefully buttoned brown overcoat, despite the stifling heat, and he carried under one arm a lacquered box tied with faded red cord. He knocked precisely 3 times. When I admitted him, the stranger removed his hat with gloved fingers and bowed with a formality not often found in Londoners outside of the diplomatic corps. "Dr. Watson," he said with a faint accent. Japanese, I thought, though his English was crisp. "It is an honor. May I speak with Mr. Holmes?" Holmes, who had not looked up from his chaise longue until this moment, turned a page of his volume and murmured, "You already are." The man's brow creased, but he did not miss a beat. "Then I come to you with a mystery I cannot explain, and one that may already be too late to stop." Indeed. Holmes closed the book with a soft thump. "And what form does your mystery take, Mr. Saito?" the man replied. "Ichiro Saito. I am cultural attaché to the Imperial Japanese delegation." "And what has brought you from diplomatic halls to my sitting room, Mr. Saito?" The man lifted the lacquered box and untied the red cord. Inside was a single unlit paper lantern. It was a delicate thing, clearly handmade. Translucent rice paper stretched over a frame of fine bamboo, painted with a curling red dragon that coiled 3 times before vanishing into a swirl of black cloud. At its base was a brass hinge and the remains of a burnt wick. Holmes took it gently in his hands, inspecting its spine, then the brushwork. "Curious," he murmured. "Japanese tradition, but Chinese iconography. Not a mass-produced object, certainly." Saito nodded. "There were 10 of them. They were part of a ceremonial installation, prepared for our autumn moon celebration, an act of goodwill and cultural exchange to be held at the Royal Pavilion in Brighton this weekend." "And yet you have only one," Holmes observed. "Because the others are gone," Saito said quietly, "and with them a man has vanished." That, I confess, caught even Holmes's attention. Saito continued, "His name is Edmund Hargrave, an English artist of some repute, known for his woodblock prints. He had been commissioned to paint the lanterns in a gesture of East-West unity. They were to be the centerpiece of the event, lit at dusk on the final evening to float over the Pavilion Gardens. Holmes steepled his fingers. Go on. 2 nights ago, Mr. Hargrave was staying in the East Pavilion guest quarters under embassy supervision. He retired early, alone. He was seen entering his room at 10:04 p.m. by a footman. The lanterns were locked in the adjoining workshop. The windows were secured. Guards stood watch at every exit, but in the morning, both Hargrave and the lanterns were gone. Gone, I repeated. All of them, without a trace, Sato confirmed. The door remained locked from the inside. No sign of struggle. The only thing found in the room, he gestured to the box, was this, the final lantern, unlit, undamaged, and entirely out of place. Holmes rose to his feet and walked to the window, cradling the lantern in his hands. A locked room, a vanished man, and 9 missing lanterns. He turned. You see why you intrigue me. Saito bowed slightly. And I have no one else to turn to. Scotland Yard has dismissed it as a staged disappearance. They say Hargrave left of his own volition. But I know the man. He would not abandon such a commission, not when he was so proud of his work. Was he paid in advance? Holmes asked. No. He insisted on being paid only upon completion. A point of honor. Holmes nodded, then gestured to the seat across from the fireplace. Mr. Sato, he said, you have my attention. Watson and I shall travel to Brighton today. And I dare say, by moonrise tomorrow, we shall know more of your vanishing artist, and the path traced by your paper lanterns. Saito's face, though reserved, revealed a flicker of relief. I will make the arrangements, he said, rising. As the door shut behind him, Holmes turned to me with that peculiar brightness that only came when a proper enigma had entered his sphere. Well, Watson, he said, how often does one receive an invitation to a festival, a locked-room puzzle and a dragon's tail, all in the same morning? Rarely, I said, smiling, though I doubt we'll enjoy the festival part. Perhaps not, Holmes murmured, but we shall follow the trail, wherever it leads. He tapped the lantern once, and for a moment, in the filtered morning light, the dragon on its surface seemed to writhe. Chapter 2. The case begins. Holmes and Watson's first discussion. We departed for Brighton that same afternoon, taking the 3:15 express from Victoria Station. The journey south passed in companionable silence for the first half hour. Holmes absorbed in his thoughts while I reviewed my notes. Rain smeared the windows in long diagonal strokes, and the sky over the coast ahead hung low and brooding, like the opening act of an unwritten play. It was not until we passed Crichton that Holmes stirred and reached for the lacquered box, which Sato had left with him. He opened it again with great care, withdrawing the lone paper lantern and turning it in the lamplight. You've noted the pattern, he said suddenly, eyes fixed on the inked dragon. I looked over. The dragon coils 3 times red, curling into black smoke. Chinese, as you said, but Saito is Japanese. Precisely. The brush technique is Japanese, but the iconography is from Ming Dynasty mythology. This hybridization is deliberate, not accidental. Hargrave wanted to make a statement. Fusion, not imitation. Likely part of the intended symbolism for the festival. Holmes studied the base of the lantern, and yet, despite the care of the painting, this particular lantern was left behind, not stolen with the others. Why? Ah, Holmes said, now there is the question. Consider, If one steals ceremonial objects of no apparent monetary value, why not take all of them? And if one chooses to leave only one behind, is it not reasonable to assume it was intended as a message? I considered that. A signature, perhaps. I considered that. A signature, perhaps. Or a warning. Or more likely, a puzzle. Holmes leaned back in the seat, the lantern balanced on his fingertips. You will have noted, Watson, the thin brass ring around the hinge at the bottom. Yes, a standard fitting surely. Standard in form, yes, but the patina is irregular, suggesting it was handled more than the others, or perhaps replaced. He placed the lantern down between us and tapped a single fingernail against the bamboo ribbing. It is a mistake to view objects as inert. Watson, this lantern has a life of its own. It was chosen to be left behind. That is no accident. And the disappearance? Now we approached the theatre of the thing. Holmes steepled his fingers. Let us suppose for a moment that Hargrave did not vanish of his own accord. He was inside a locked room, guarded externally, with no signs of forced entry or exit. How then is his disappearance possible? I frowned. Hidden passage? The East Pavilion was rebuilt in 1876. I examined the architectural plans before we left. It was constructed for temporary diplomatic housing, ornamental but secure. The walls are sealed. No servants' corridor. No trapdoors. Only 2 windows, both locked from within. Then it's impossible. Holmes smiled faintly. There is no such thing, Watson. Only unconsidered possibilities. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a second object. Something I had not noticed him take earlier from Baker Street. It was a short fragment of stiff paper, about an inch wide and curved, as if torn from a cylindrical surface. Where did that come from? Holmes inspected it beneath the lamp. The interior of the lantern, tucked between the folds. I found it while you were fetching the timetable this morning. Writing. A single character. He held it up for me to see. Painted in bold, deliberate black strokes was the symbol. Ho kanji, I said after a moment. For fire. Very good, Holmes replied. A fitting symbol for a lantern, yes, but why hidden? I had no answer. The train gave a shudder. As we began our descent into Brighton, Holmes carefully returned the paper to its envelope and stowed the lantern once more. This case, Watson, is not merely a puzzle of disappearance. It is a performance. Every element, Hargrave's vanishing, the stolen lanterns, the untouched room, has been staged for effect. Someone wishes to be seen, and yet not known. I leaned forward. You think the artist was abducted? I think, Holmes said, that the artist may have been an unwilling actor in someone else's play. The train pulled into the station with a hiss of steam. We stepped onto the platform to find Mr. Saito waiting for us, precisely as arranged. He bowed deeply, then gestured to a waiting carriage. The pavilion has made quarters available for you, he said. Inspector Durant from the Brighton Constabulary is also expecting you. He is skeptical of your involvement, but I believe he will listen. Then let us make good use of his time, Holmes replied, climbing in. As we wound our way through the streets of Brighton, the famous domes of the Royal Pavilion came into view. Rising like some mirage from another continent, their white turrets gleaming beneath the storm-heavy sky. Brighton, Holmes murmured, is a curious place, Watson. a seaside town wearing the borrowed robes of an empire. He leaned forward as the carriage passed beneath a wooden arch hung with silk banners. They fluttered weakly in the wind, red and white, marked with calligraphy. Among them, a string of unlit lanterns dangled like a procession of heads. Only 9 of them. Holmes straightened. "There," he said. "They've been returned." Saito followed his gaze. "Yes, this morning. They were found outside the pavilion gates, strung in perfect sequence. And no sign of Hargrave. None," Saito said. Holmes looked toward me. "Now, the trail begins in earnest, Watson. The question is not who stole the lanterns, but what story they intend to tell with them." Chapter 3. The First Clues, a Scene of Deception. We arrived at the Royal Pavilion just as the sun broke briefly through, the clouds casting a pale light upon its domes and minarets. The contrast between the building's exotic facade and the staid grey of the brightened sky lent the scene an otherworldly character, and it was easy to believe one had stepped into a dream or a theatre. Mr. Saito led us through a side entrance, guarded by a constable in full dress. Inside, the pavilion's eastern wing had been cordoned off for private cultural use. The walls were hung with silk drapes, and incense lingered faintly in the air, masking the sharper scent of damp wood and aged stone. "The guest quarters are this way," Saito said quietly. "Hargrave stayed here for the past week while completing the lanterns." He opened a narrow door leading into a richly decorated suite of rooms. 1 bedroom, 1 adjoining workshop. Both bore signs of recent careful occupation. A teacup rested undisturbed beside the window. A book on Japanese brushwork lay open, its spine cracked but pages unruffled. Brushes had been washed and stacked in precise rows near the workbench. Holmes moved through the space slowly, saying nothing at first. His eyes flicked over surfaces and shadows alike, his gloved hands tracing lines along the doorframe and windowsill. "There are no signs of forced entry," Saito offered. The constables confirmed it. The door was still locked from the inside when we discovered he was missing. Holmes nodded absently. "And the windows?" Saito gestured. "Both secured with brass latches. No tampering. Both open onto a small courtyard. But there were guards posted on the main gate all night. No one saw movement." Holmes approached the nearest window and examined the latch. Then he pulled it open, testing the hinge with careful deliberation. "Not recently used," he murmured. "Dust in the grooves, undisturbed. That speaks to truth." He turned and stepped into the adjoining room, the studio. Here, the atmosphere changed. Though no sign of a struggle could be seen, something in the air felt wrong. The room was too neat, too composed. There was no paint on the floor, no splash of color, no frayed cord from a working artist's process. The lanterns were gone. Only 9 brass stands remained where they had rested in a perfect crescent. Holmes stood at the center of the room, eyes closed. He inhaled deeply. "Lavender oil," he said. I sniffed. "I don't smell anything." "That's because it's faint now, fainter than it should be. You see, Watson, Hargrave was known for his sensitivities. He once wrote of scent as a sacred brush in the air. The smell of lavender was likely used during his work, perhaps for concentration or comfort. But here, it lingers just enough to be recent, without evidence of the source. He turned to Saito. Did Mr. Hargrave burn oils in this room? Saito shook his head. Not to my knowledge. No incense was authorized. The pavilion has strict policies about open flame. Then someone else brought it. Holmes murmured. Deliberately. He crouched by the brass stands and examined their bases. One, he noted, was slightly askew. He reached into the recess, beneath it, and retrieved a sliver of something dark and fibrous, barely longer than a fingernail. What is that? I asked. Wick, he said. Unburnt, charcoal primed, not wax. Holmes stood again and glanced around the room. No ash, no matches, and yet he pointed to the ceiling. Do you see that, Watson? I followed his gaze. A section of the ceiling panel, ornately carved and painted, was fractionally ajar, as if something had pressed against it from below. A false panel? Perhaps, Holmes said, but more likely a gap in insulation. This building was refitted many times, the eastern wing especially. I believe the heat from 9 small flames might just have disturbed that panel if they were lit in unison, and snuffed out with equal precision. Saito looked uneasy, but the lanterns were not meant to be lit until the ceremony. Holmes turned to him. Then whoever took them chose to begin the ceremony early. He returned to the bedroom and gestured for Saito to wait outside. Once we were alone, Holmes closed the door and motioned for me to stand at the center of the room. What do you see, Watson? I scanned the space. A bed, a desk, a chair, books, notes. His coat is gone. Yes, but not his shoes. Holmes crossed to the bed and pointed beneath it. A pair of polished leather shoes sat side by side, neatly placed. He vanished, Holmes said, without his shoes, without his coat, without disturbing a thing. And yet the lanterns, delicate, paper-skinned, each requiring careful handling, were moved without breaking even a single frame. I stared. So how? Holmes leaned close to the window and tapped the glass. The answer is in the reflection, he said. I joined him and followed his gaze. In the opposite pane, just visible, was the outer courtyard, and beyond that, a shallow reflecting pool lined with stone. A mirror, Holmes said, still and silent, perfect for light. You think someone carried the lanterns across the courtyard? No, Holmes replied. I think someone floated them. He turned abruptly and strode back to the studio, where he opened a tall cabinet with a rusted handle. Inside were rolls of silk, some torn, and a stack of thin bamboo rods. Holmes pulled, free a length of silk and held it against the lantern stand. Long enough for tethering, he said, strong enough to support weight, but delicate enough not to drag. He turned to me. Watson, we are no longer investigating a disappearance. We are chasing a procession, a ritual. He stepped into the center of the room, his gaze distant, and the stage, he added, has only just been set. Chapter 4. The Gathering of Suspects. The following morning, under a thin drizzle that lent a ghostly sheen to the pavilion's white domes, Holmes requested that Mr. Saito arrange a private meeting with everyone who had access to the East Wing during the days leading up to Hargrave's disappearance. The gathering took place in the pavilion's long drawing room. a gilded space of dragon chandeliers and lacquered columns, which lent the affair an air of theatrical unreality. As though we were not solving a disappearance, but rehearsing a drama. Inspector Durant of the Brighton Constabulary arrived first, square-jawed, suspicious of Holmes, and dressed in the sort of too-neat uniform that often concealed a restless temperament. "I trust this won't take long, Mr. Holmes," he said, arms crossed as he surveyed the room. "Your involvement here has not been officially sanctioned." Holmes replied without looking at him. "On the contrary, Inspector. I believe our inquiries will save you time, once you've run out of red herrings." Durant bristled but said nothing further. One by one, the others arrived, introduced by Mr. Sato with formal brevity. First was Miss Althea Voss, a woman of sharp cheekbones and sharper glances, dressed in dark silk and clutching a parasol despite the rain. She was Hargrave's assistant, according to Saito, a painter herself, though of a less public inclination. "He would not have left willingly," she said flatly. "His work was everything to him, especially this commission." "Ruda, relationship was close?" Holmes asked. "I mixed his pigments and translated the brush motifs from his notes," she replied. "If you're suggesting I know more than that, I suggest you reconsider your assumptions." Holmes merely bowed. Next came Mr. Felix Mercer, an events liaison from the pavilion staff. Tall, nervous, and prone to running a hand through his thinning hair, he kept glancing toward Durant as if seeking silent approval. "I was in charge of coordinating the festival setup," he said. "Decor, vendors, logistics. I checked the East Wing each morning for updates on the lanterns." Hargrave was meticulous, almost obsessive. "In what way?" Holmes asked. Mercer hesitated. He insisted on ritual, the order of painting, the timing of silence. He spoke very little, especially once the 9th lantern was finished. Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. "Only 9? Mercer blinked. "Oh, yes. The 10th had been prepared in advance. Something he called a keystone lantern. Said it would only be lit at the right moment." Holmes nodded, but said nothing further. Then came Professor Langford, a man in his early 60s with silver-rimmed spectacles and a voice tinged with wary authority. He introduced himself as a scholar of East Asian literature and cultural consultant. "For the pavilion, I advised on symbolic elements," he said, but Hargrave kept most of his creative decisions to himself. He was not easily steered. "You disliked him," Holmes observed. Langford's brow furrowed. "I found his interpretations careless. He blurred traditions that ought not be blurred. Sacred symbols were repainted as decorative patterns." "Believe he disrespected the culture?" I asked. Langford folded his arms. "I believe he misunderstood it. And when one mixes fire and shadow in ignorance, accidents occur." His final word lingered in the room longer than the others. Lastly came Miss Willow Enfield, the pavilion's seasonal archivist. A woman of soft voice, large eyes, and nervous hands. She had been assigned to catalogue historical references and assist Professor Langford with translations. "I saw Mr. Hargrave only once," she said. "He asked for scrolls from the Moon Ceremony archives." "Which scrolls? I don't know. He was very specific. Wanted original illustrations from the Rugujo cycle, the dragon lantern myths." Holmes's gaze flicked toward her. "Did he tell you why?" She hesitated. "He said he wanted the lanterns to feel true." but also something else. He said the 10th lantern had to know the way. Holmes turned, and for a moment his expression shifted, just slightly. A ripple beneath the surface. Saito dismissed the group with quiet efficiency. As they filed out, Holmes watched each of them carefully. Durant muttered something about unorthodox proceedings and stalked after them. When they were gone, Holmes paced the length of the drawing room, hands behind his back. "Well, Watson," he said at last, "our stage is set." "They all seem credible," I said, "each with reason to be involved, and yet none with reason to commit harm." Holmes turned to the window. Outside, the lanterns strung along the pavilion's eaves fluttered in the breeze. 9 of them, restored, their delicate paper undamaged. Miss Voss is sharp, clever enough to assist Hargrave, and clever enough to mislead. But she's also a painter. That leaves pigment. Mercer has motive to protect the pavilion's reputation, especially if a scandal would cost him his position. Langford resents cultural fusion. And Miss Enfield, he trailed off. "She's afraid of something," I said. She barely spoke above a whisper. Holmes nodded. "Yes, but not guilty, not yet." He crossed to the far wall, where a framed scroll of Japanese calligraphy hung behind protective glass. "The Ryugu-jo cycle," he murmured. "A dragon's palace beneath the sea. A lantern to guide the soul. Fire in the fog." He turned, back to me. "This is not merely a mystery of theft or disappearance, Watson. This is a story someone has written. With ink, with silence, and with light. And unless I miss my guess, it is not yet finished." Chapter 5. First Suspects. The red herring. The next morning dawned bright and windless, a temporary reprieve from the sullen coastal weather. Holmes was already at work before breakfast, seated cross-legged on the floor of the guest chamber, surrounded by scraps of silk and pencil rubbings of the lantern's wooden bases. A faint trail of tea steam curled beside him. I, meanwhile, had returned from the post with a freshly folded Brighton Herald. Its headline leapt out at once. "Artist flees with cultural relics. Police pursue lantern thief across county lines." Below it, an artist's exaggerated rendering of Edmund Hargrave, looking wild-eyed and almost villainous, sat beneath a subheading proclaiming "Pavilion staff member questioned." Holmes took the paper without comment and skimmed it while, sipping his tea. After a few moments he folded it and tossed it aside. "Durant moves swiftly, though not wisely," he said. "Do you think he's truly arrested someone? Almost certainly. And almost certainly the wrong person." Just then, a knock came at the door, and Mr. Saito entered with a furrowed brow. "Inspector Durant requests your presence in the West Hall," he said. "He believes he has solved the case." Holmes rose and dusted silk threads from his sleeves. "Then let us applaud his performance." We followed Saito through the tiled corridors of the pavilion to the Grand West Hall, where Durant stood beside a constable and seated on a low bench, a slumped and sullen figure, Felix Mercer, the events coordinator. "I've no intention of turning this into a debate," Durant said the moment we entered. "The man was found early this morning, attempting to burn papers behind the east stables. Among them, these." He held up a singed scrap. a scroll fragment bearing the same red dragon motif we had seen on the surviving lantern. Another item, smaller and intact, was a receipt from a Brighton stationery dealer, dated 3 weeks prior, listing pigment supplies and a roll of silken cord. Items consistent with the lantern's creation, Durant said triumphantly, and Mercer had access to the rooms, the schedule, and the guest list. He's the link between Hargrave and the pavilion's logistics. He claims he's innocent, of course, but the evidence speaks for itself. Holmes said nothing for a longer moment. He stepped forward, studying Mercer's face, not with the gaze of an accuser, but the quiet curiosity of a man examining a fracture in glass. "Mr. Mercer," he said at last, "why burn the papers?" Mercer looked up, eyes weary. "Because they were mine. Sketches, old copies of Hargrave's studies. I didn't want anyone to think I'd stolen his ideas." Durant scoffed. "A convenient story." Holmes turned to Durant. "What of the pigment receipt? It matches the inks used on the lanterns, but also matches the pavilion's registered art suppliers, does it not?" Holmes asked quietly. "And were the pigments delivered directly to Mercer?" Durant hesitated. "No, to the front desk." "Then you have no proof Mercer used them for the lanterns?" Holmes replied. "Only that he handled documents resembling Hargrave's work. That alone does not make a thief." Durant frowned but said nothing. Holmes turned back to Mercer. "Mr. Mercer, tell me plainly, what did you believe was happening in that studio?" Mercer shifted, looking shamefaced. "I don't know. Hargrave became strange. He kept whispering things about spirits, about how each lantern was a gate. I thought he'd gone too far, that he was mixing ceremony with madness. I stayed away." "But you kept his notes." "I admired him," Mercer said softly. "I wanted to learn. Maybe someday paint something of my own. But I didn't steal anything, I swear." Holmes nodded slowly. "Then I believe you, Mr. Mercer, though your timing was unfortunate." Durant's jaw tightened. "I'm not convinced." "You seldom are," Holmes murmured. "Yet the truth remains unaffected." Turned and walked slowly toward one of the windows, overlooking the pavilion's rear courtyard. The pool glinted in the morning light, and the paper lanterns strung overhead swayed in a breeze so slight it might have come from a dream. "There is a rhythm to all of this, Watson," he said softly. "A pattern." He looked back at Durant. "Inspector, if you would be so kind, release Mr. Mercer and instruct your men to search the reflecting pool. Not for a body, but for ink." "Ink," Holmes smiled faintly. "If Hargrave works near water and believed the lanterns were symbols of spiritual gates, he may have left something behind. Not on canvas, but cast adrift." Durant snorted but signaled his men. Mercer was released with a warning. As we stepped into the morning light, Holmes paused by one of the returned lanterns. "This one is different," he said. "Do you see?" I examined it. "Same design, same paper." "Yes, but the knot." Holmes pointed. "The red silken cord is looped left over right on the others. On this one, right over left, a funerary knot." "What does it mean?" "Means," Holmes said, "that one of these lanterns wasn't meant to be displayed. It was meant to be buried." We stood in silence for a moment longer. Holmes straightened, brushing his coat. "Come, Watson. We must speak again with Miss Voss." She said she only mixed the pigments. I intend to ask her which pigments, and whether she noticed Hargrave begin work on a 10th lantern. Chapter 6. The Secret Clue. A hidden... We found Miss Althea Voss in the conservatory, standing alone beneath a suspended arrangement of hanging orchids, her silhouette framed by the angular panes of glass that cast shifting patterns of light across the marble floor. A satchel of brushes and parchment lay at her feet. She was sketching something with a charcoal stick, her strokes quick, clean, and controlled. She turned at our approach and studied us with the air of a woman already tired of conversation. "If this is about Mercer," she said, "I suppose you've come to tell me he's confessed and we can all go home." "On the contrary," Holmes replied, "Mr. Mercer is quite innocent. His only crime was the possession of inspiration. Though I do sympathize with his timing." She arched a brow. "Then I suppose I'm next in line." "Possibly," Holmes said without irony, "but not for the reason you imagine." He gestured toward the stool across from her. "May we sit?" She hesitated, then nodded. Holmes lowered himself slowly and rested his gloved hands on the edge of the table. "Miss Voss, you told us you mixed pigments for Mr. Hargrave, that you prepared his materials, translated his brushwork. Is that correct?" She said, folding her arms. He was left-handed and preferred to paint with a specific gradient of vermilion that had to be balanced against oxblood, not a standard technique. Holmes tilted his head. "And what of the ink?" She frowned. "India ink, mixed with boiled walnut husk for depth. He insisted it be hand-ground." "Were you present when he completed the 9th lantern?" "Du Buwig Ed was," she said. "He finished the last stroke just after midnight. Then he told me I should rest, that he wanted to spend the final evening alone with the work." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "The final evening? You're certain he said that?" "Verbatim," she replied. "Why?" "Because," Holmes said, leaning back, "the 10th lantern, the so-called keystone, was not completed before his disappearance. Or so we were led to believe." She hesitated, caught off guard. "I don't know what you mean," she said, but the edge in her voice was gone. Holmes withdrew a folded paper from his coat and laid it on the table. It was the fragment he'd found in the 1st lantern. The scrap with the kanji character for fire. "This," he said softly, "was hidden inside the lantern you claimed not to have seen since its construction. But the ink used here is India ink. It's sumi, a traditional Japanese carbon ink with a different mineral base. You said Hargrave used walnut husk mixtures. This was prepared with ash and charcoal." She stared at the symbol. "He didn't mix that in my presence," she admitted after a pause, "but he asked me a week before the festival to retrieve sumi ink from the pavilion archive. I thought he wanted it for contrast. He said he needed it for something that shouldn't be touched by the West." Holmes leaned forward. "Miss Voss, did Hargrave speak of death?" She blinked. "Once. He said the 10th lantern wasn't meant to be seen, that it would lead him beyond." "Beyond what?" She shook her head. "He didn't say, but I thought he was being dramatic." Holmes stood and walked slowly to the window. Outside in the pavilion garden, the paper lanterns swayed gently in the growing breeze, 9 of them, unlit, waiting. He turned back. "Did you know about the scrolls from the Ryugujo cycle?" "Yes," she said. "He studied them obsessively. Said they held the real shape of the world. I thought he meant visually, like perspective, but I wasn't so sure after the 8th night." "What happened on the 8th night?" She hesitated. I heard him whispering, alone, talking to the lanterns, and one word kept repeating. She paused, then spoke it aloud, slowly. "Uboom." Looked to Holmes, puzzled. He nodded slowly. "A spirit. A mother who dies in childbirth and returns as a ghost, often depicted in white robes, guiding the lost with flickering lights." I shivered. "A strange motif for a festival." "Or the perfect one," Holmes said, "if one wished to turn the ceremony into a passage, not just for spirits but for oneself." He turned back to Voss. "Did Hargrave speak of leaving?" "Only once," she said, her voice very low. "He told me that the lanterns weren't the end of his work, but the beginning." Holmes nodded and thanked her quietly. As we stepped out into the corridor, he remained silent for a moment, his mind plainly working through some unseen equation. "Well," I asked, "what does it mean?" Holmes turned sharply. "It means, Watson, that we have been looking for a man who vanished. But what if he meant to vanish? You think he faked it?" "I think," Holmes said, "that Hargrave may have written his own disappearance into the very strokes of his art. A ritual, a story, a vanishing not by force, but by design." We returned to the East Wing workshop. Holmes moved directly to the water basin, where Hargrave's brushes had been cleaned. He sifted through the bottom of the basin with gloved fingers, then held up a narrow object, a fine needle of wood. "What is it?" I asked. "Bamboo," Holmes said, "shaved thin, ink-stained, and sharpened. For writing? Not quite." He turned it in his fingers. "For piercing, to release something small, a drop, a scent." He stood, thoughtful. "Watson, I believe Hargrave created more than just art. I believe he laced his final lanterns with a compound, something released when lit, a fume, a vision, perhaps even a toxin. One that does not kill, but alters perception." I stared at him. "You believe he poisoned himself? I believe he transcended himself. In his own mind, at least." Holmes looked back toward the 9 lanterns swaying outside. "And the 10th, Watson? Wherever it is, it may be the only key left to unlocking how he did it." Chapter 7. The crime grows. Stranger, that evening, the wind rose without warning. By the time we returned to the pavilion, the paper lanterns strung across the garden paths had begun to twist on their cords like silent pendulums, their unlit bellies dancing in the gusts. The sky was awash in grey and silver, clouds moving fast, and somewhere across the sea, thunder muttered softly. Holmes was unusually quiet. He had not spoken a word since we left the East Wing, though I saw in his gait and eyes that his mind was afire. It was not the stillness of calm, but of fierce internal movement, like a man reading the last page of a book in which he suspects he himself appears. We crossed the garden and re-entered the workshop under the pavilion's eastern dome, where Holmes resumed his search with a quiet, relentless focus. I stood beside him, watching as he moved from lantern stand to cabinet to wall panel with the methodical grace of a pianist, checking every note. "What exactly are we looking for?" I asked at last. "The keystone," Holmes replied without turning. Not metaphorically, literally. He knelt beside the base of the wall, near the scroll cabinet, and tapped lightly along the lower trim. He left a trail, Watson, but not in his art, in his architecture. Just then a voice rang from the hall. "Mr. Holmes, come quickly." It was Miss Enfield, the archivist, pale, breathless. Her hands gripped the doorframe like someone who had run through a nightmare to reach it. Holmes sprang to his feet. "What is it?" She gasped. "I went to retrieve a scroll for Professor Langford, one from the sealed cabinet, but when I opened it..." Her voice failed. Holmes was already moving. We followed her through the winding hall into the pavilion's central library, where the ancient texts were kept under lock and key. She led us to a narrow room lined with carved shelves and drawn drapes. A single gas lamp burned at the far end. There, resting on the long display table, was a scroll unrolled halfway across its surface. Its lower edge was wet. Holmes stepped forward. A faint scent met my nostrils, sweet, earthy, cloying. "Lavender?" I said, instantly recalling his earlier remark. "No," Holmes replied softly. "Not quite. Lavender laced with something else. A masking note." He lifted the scroll delicately, with a gloved hand. Beneath it the table's varnish had bubbled faintly. Holmes lowered his face toward it and sniffed. Then he straightened, suddenly tense. "What is it?" I asked. "Belladonna," he murmured, "in trace amounts, applied to the scroll in liquid form. It evaporates quickly, but leaves residue. This is not archival preservation, Watson. It's delivery." Miss Enfield clutched her chest. "Delivery of what?" "Perception," Holmes said, "and distortion." I looked at the scroll again. The painted image along its lower border was unsettling. Lanterns, yes, but not like the others we had seen. These were floating along a shoreless sea, beneath a pale moon painted in smudged grey. Beneath them, faint brushwork suggested faces, mouths open not in joy, but in anguish. "Someone painted this?" I asked. Holmes examined the corner signature. "Not someone, Hargrave." He held up the scroll's backing. A small note was pressed into the edge. Thin, silk-bound, nearly transparent, it read, "To see the truth, one must burn the veil." Holmes closed the scroll carefully. "Watson," he said, "I am more convinced than ever that this is not a disappearance. It is a ritual." We returned to the East Wing at once, but Holmes no longer moved with the cool detachment I had grown so used to. Instead, he was unsettled, his steps swift, his eyes darting not just to the corners of rooms, but to shadows, as though expecting something to emerge from them. "Are you well?" I asked. Holmes paused at the studio doorway. He turned to me, and, in the fading light from the courtyard lanterns, I saw something rare in his eyes: uncertainty. "I've seen many minds distort truth to serve delusion," he said, "but rarely have I seen a mind build its delusion with such care, such architectural precision." "You think Hargrave was mad?" Holmes shook his head. "No, I think he was performing madness. For whom, I do not yet know." He stepped inside and stopped. A paper had been pinned to the center of the wall. It had not been there before. Holmes approached cautiously, plucking it from the plaster. It was thin parchment, painted in sumi ink. The same dragon from the lantern, coiled 3 times, but beneath it, In a rough hand was scrawled a single word: soon. I felt a chill crawl across my shoulders. Holmes stared at it in silence. Then he folded it without comment and placed it in his coat. "Someone is playing a part," he said, "and I do not yet know whether Hargrave is the director or the ghost." He turned to me. "Tomorrow night, Watson, the full moon will rise over the pavilion. The same night the lantern ceremony was to take place. I believe something has been set in motion, and if we do not uncover the final piece by then, it may be too late to stop it." Chapter 8. Holmes tests a theory. The next day was one of rare stillness in Brighton. The wind had calmed, the sky hung like dull parchment above the pavilion, and the sea held its breath somewhere beyond the rooftops. It was a day poised between movements, a lull before the next act. Holmes awoke early and dressed with quiet determination. There was something sharper in his motions that morning, though not hurried. He said little over tea, and even less during our brief walk through the pavilion gardens, where the 9 lanterns remained strung in their crescent arc, untouched since their return. It was not until late morning that Holmes spoke his true intention. I'm going to speak with Professor Langford," he said abruptly, turning from the garden path toward the east wing. "Langford," I said. "You suspect him?" "I suspect only that he believes himself above suspicion," Holmes replied. "And that, Watson, is a dangerous comfort." We found Professor Langford in the pavilion's reading gallery, examining a scroll beneath magnifying glass. His expression was one of academic irritation, though whether at the scroll or our presence I could not at first tell. "Mr. Holmes," he said without looking up, "I assume you have something urgent to justify interrupting my work again." "I wouldn't dream of interfering with scholarship," Holmes said mildly, "but I came across a note this morning that I thought might interest you." He withdrew a folded parchment from his coat. The dragon sketch we had found the night before, the one bearing the ominous word "soon." I should have seen it sooner. The 10th lantern, he wouldn't leave it in the studio. It would be hidden, close enough to light, far enough to conceal. He reached the top landing and turned left, moving toward a narrow supply room, whose door bore a broken brass knob. Holmes pulled it open. Inside was a single object, covered in silk. He stepped forward, drew back the cloth. And there it was, the 10th lantern. It was smaller than the others, painted in pure white, with no dragon, no color. Only a single black ring encircling its base like a closed eye. "Holmes, did not touch it, Watson," he said, his voice low. "Tonight, someone will try to light this, and if they do..." He looked at me with that rare glint, part revelation, part dread. Then the final act begins. Chapter 9. A second attempt. The culprit strikes again. The sun slipped beneath the western horizon with an eerie haste that evening, as though the day itself had no desire to witness what the night might bring. The pavilion, washed in twilight, took on an unnatural quietness. Lamps were being lit across the garden walks, their amber glow flickering in shallow pools of light, while the unlit paper lanterns above them trembled on unseen currents. The moon rose slowly, vast and pale. It cast a silver sheen over the domes of the pavilion, illuminating every curve and spire with a cold brilliance. Holmes stood beneath the east wing arch, his gaze fixed on the crescent string of 9 lanterns swaying just beyond the reflecting pool. "The 10th is the key," he said. "But the question is not merely who will light it, but when and why now." "You're certain someone will attempt it tonight?" I asked. Holmes gave a slow nod. "Tonight is the first full moon since Hargrave vanished." The scroll spoke of cycles, a gate, a ritual. Whoever orchestrated this believes the light will complete something. It is theatre, Watson, but theatre of a darker sort. He turned as Saito approached from the shadows. "The guards have been posted as requested," Saito said quietly. "The pavilion perimeter is secure, but there is tension among the staff. A rumor has spread that one of the lanterns has gone missing again." Holmes raised a brow. "Which one?" Saito hesitated. "The 9th. Holmes exhaled. "Of course, the final step before the 10th. He turned sharply. "Come, Watson, we must get ahead of the scene." Holmes led us not to the gardens as I expected, but into the pavilion's central atrium. An ornate chamber of carved mahogany, gilded pillars, and hanging paper lanterns that had been purely decorative until now. It was dimly lit, quiet. 2 constables stood at opposite ends, their expressions wary. Miss Enfield was seated on a low bench beside the staircase, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Holmes addressed her with uncharacteristic softness. "You saw someone, didn't you?" She looked up, startled. I don't know. Perhaps." "You're not certain?" "I saw a figure near the west stairs, dressed in dark robes. I thought it might be one of the performers, but—" She broke off. "But what?" Holmes asked gently. "It wasn't the way they moved," she said. "It was how they stopped, as though listening for something only they could hear." Holmes nodded. "The 9th lantern is not missing," he said, more to himself than to us. "It's been relocated." He turned to Saito. "Have the garden lights dimmed in 15 minutes, just slightly, enough to allow a single flame to draw the eye?" Saito hesitated. "You want to invite them?" Langford's expression darkened at the sight of it. "Another of Hargrave's dramatics. You've seen his work take this form before?" Langford gave a dry snort. "Mr. Holmes, the man was an artist in the most exhausting sense. Everything was metaphor. Even when he was coherent, he laced his conversation with riddles and half-references. He was obsessed with cycles, death, rebirth, shadows. He believed the lanterns were, what did he call them? Psycho-spiritual vessels. Did you believe him mad?" Holmes asked. Langford looked up sharply now. "Mad? No, that would be too simple. He was dangerous, Mr. Holmes. Not for what he believed, but for how deeply he wanted others to believe it too." Holmes studied the man for a long moment. Then, in a shift so subtle it might have passed unnoticed, he said, "Professor, do you know what happened to the Keystone Lantern?" Langford blinked. "I beg your pardon." "The 10th, the final piece of the ritual Hargrave designed. Ure mentioned it to Miss Voss, and again to Miss Enfield. A lantern that was not to be lit until the right moment." Langford's expression shifted, just slightly. "I heard him speak of a final lantern, yes, but I assumed it was symbolic." "And yet he worked with precision," Holmes replied. "He even mixed a separate ink for it. And if that lantern were found, if it were lit, Do you believe something might occur? Langford's mouth tightened. If it exists, it should be destroyed. The man was meddling with symbols far beyond his understanding. Holmes nodded as if in agreement. Then I suppose it's fortunate that no one has lit it yet. Langford stared at him. What do you mean? Holmes offered nothing but a faint smile. We took our leave shortly after, but as we stepped into the corridor, I turned to Holmes. What was that? A test, he murmured. Langford responded as I suspected he might, with fear. You think he's involved? I think he knows more than he admits, possibly about Hargrave's true intent. Holmes quickened his pace. I need to speak with Miss Enfield again. There's something in the scroll chamber, something that doesn't fit. We found the archivist in the West Wing, quietly sorting a tray of ivory markers used for translation indexing. Her hands trembled slightly when she saw us. I found something, she said before we could speak. She held out a thin slip of paper, folded once, unsealed. Holmes took it and opened it. It read, "The path is marked by silence. The 10th must not be lit before the moon watches." Below the words was the faint imprint of a fingerprint, in soot or perhaps ink. This was tucked inside the archival ledger. Miss Enfield whispered, "No one else has access. I only opened it this morning." Holmes turned the paper over. "Left thumbprint," he said. "Too large for Miss Foss, too wide for Hargrave. Possibly male, possibly Langford." He stared at the words again. "The 10th must not be lit before the moon watches." He looked up. "Tonight is the full moon." Miss Enfield nodded slowly. "He believed something would happen," she whispered. "He believed the light would open a gate." "A gate to what?" I asked. She hesitated. "He never said. Only that the cycle must be completed." Holmes stood still for a long moment. Then, suddenly, he turned on his heel. "Watson, come." We hurried through the pavilion corridors until we reached the central stair that led to the servants' lofts, now used for storage. Holmes ascended with uncharacteristic haste, muttering to himself, "I want them to think the moment has come." Holmes replied. "Holmes," I said under my breath, "is this wise?" He turned to me, his voice low. "No net catches a fish that doesn't swim to it willingly. Whoever orchestrated this wants an audience. We give them the stage." He removed something from his pocket, the white lantern, wrapped in protective silk, and placed it carefully on the small stone plinth in the atrium's center. "And now," he said softly, "we wait." The pavilion seemed to breathe in silence. Outside, the wind picked up again, bending the paper lanterns like bowed heads. Somewhere, a distant bell rang the hour. Then, faintly at first, a creaking sound. Holmes gestured. One constable moved silently into position behind a column. I took my place behind the lacquered screen just left of the stair. The creaking came again, floorboards, and then the figure. Draped in black robes, their face obscured by a painted half-mask. Ivory, with streaks of red like tears. They moved, with deliberate slowness, approaching the central plinth where the white lantern waited. They removed from their sleeve a match. Holmes didn't move. The match flared. The white lantern began to glow. Softly, hauntingly, light spread from its belly in slow, pulsing waves, illuminating the atrium with an otherworldly gleam. And then, just as the masked figure stepped back, Holmes, he crossed the chamber, seizing the figure by the wrist and tearing the mask free. A gasp escaped Miss Enfield's lips. It was Professor Langford. The scholar blinked into the sudden brightness, his face pale, his mouth open, but silent. Holmes said nothing, nor did Langford speak. Instead, it was Miss Foss, who had entered moments earlier with Saito, who broke the silence. "You were the one who told Hargrave the lanterns were incomplete," she said, her voice shaking. "You planted the idea that something was missing." Langford said nothing. His eyes darted to the glowing lantern. "I only wanted to correct the record," he murmured at last. "Hargrave's work, his fusion of East and West, was careless, dangerous. He needed structure." "You gave him structure," Holmes said. Langford looked up. "I gave him a map. He believed it was his own creation, but it was my framework, my pattern, the lanterns, the scrolls, the idea of transcendence. I guided his hand. I wanted to see what would happen if someone truly believed." Holmes let the words hang in the air. "And when he disappeared," I asked, "what then?" Langford's voice cracked. "I thought he would return, but when he didn't, I tried to finish the performance." Holmes folded his arms. "But you missed one detail, Professor." Langford blinked. Holmes pointed to the lantern. "That one was never meant to be lit. It was meant to be buried." A pause. Langford staggered slightly, then collapsed into the arms of a constable. The lantern flickered once, then dimmed. Holmes stepped forward and snuffed it out. "No story," he said quietly, "can survive the lie it was built upon." Chapter 10. The true motive begins to surface. Langford was taken into custody with a quiet that bordered on indifference. He offered no resistance, nor did he speak further once the lantern was extinguished. Only when the constables placed manacles about his wrists did his shoulders finally sag, as if the weight of the performance had broken something within him. Holmes said nothing as the professor was led away. He remained at the center of the atrium, one hand resting lightly on the now darkened lantern, his brow furrowed, not in triumph, but in contemplation. I stood beside him, still absorbing the scene we had just witnessed. "So," I said softly, "Langford was the mastermind after all." Holmes glanced at me. "Was he?" I blinked. He orchestrated the symbolic ritual, manipulated Hargrave, lit the final lantern. "Yes," Holmes murmured, "but Langford's motive was ideological. He viewed Hargrave's art as a sacrilege. He wanted control over the narrative, not the man." He walked slowly to the windows, peering out toward the reflecting pool where the remaining lanterns still swayed untouched. "No, Watson, I believe Langford finished something, but not what he began. He completed a script that someone else wrote. You think there's another hand. I think," Holmes said, "there is a silence behind all the noise. And I intend to find it." Later that morning, we convened once more in the pavilion's library, now emptied of scrolls and scholars, the lingering scent of parchment and soot clinging to the air. Mr. Saito joined us, his expression unreadable. "You believe?" Professor Langford did not act alone. He asked after Holmes explained his doubts. "He lit the final lantern," Holmes said, but not for the reasons we were meant to believe. He thought he was executing a cultural correction, a symbolic exorcism of Hargrave's errors, but the ritual itself was someone else's creation. Saito folded his arms. "You think Hargrave is still alive?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he crossed to the large desk in the center of the room, where several of Hargrave's original sketches had been collected. He sorted through them with care, selecting one in particular, a brush drawing of the pavilion's rooftop domes, viewed from below, framed by lanterns. "In theater," Holmes said, "a curtain must fall before the illusion ends. In art, the final stroke is the vanishing point. Hargrave's disappearance wasn't designed to obscure guilt. It was meant to complete the work." I stepped closer. But what was the work? Holmes laid the sketch flat and tapped the lanterns at the corners. "Perspective," he said. "This piece is not about architecture. It's about placement. Hargrave's last series wasn't meant for museums or festivals. It was meant to be seen from above." He turned to Saito. "I need access to the pavilion's rooftop, immediately." The ascent was treacherous, spiraling iron staircases, narrow maintenance ladders, and a final passage through a crawl space that smelled of dust and long-settled birds. When we emerged onto the upper dome, the city stretched out before us in stillness. The pavilion's gardens lay below, like a painter's model. The string of 9 lanterns curved around the reflecting pool, the glass roofs glinting like eyes half closed in sleep. Holmes stepped to the ledge and knelt. "There," he said. I followed. His gaze, viewed from this height, and only this height, the placement of the 9 lanterns formed a perfect circle. The curve of the pool, the alignment of the chords, even the space between them. Exact. And in the center, on the far lawn, was a 10th space. Empty, but clearly marked by a worn patch of grass and a brass ring embedded in the earth. "The missing lantern," I breathed. "This was the pattern all along." Holmes nodded. "A mandala, a map, a visual key. Hargrave didn't just paint symbols, he constructed them. The pavilion itself became his canvas." He stood, and Langford, in his effort to control the ritual, unknowingly completed it. We descended in haste. Back in the pavilion, Holmes made for the secured storage rooms beneath the studio wing. An area not yet searched, reserved for festival equipment. A custodian unlocked the door, revealing crates, ropes, and ceremonial materials in a dusty gloom. Holmes moved immediately to a lacquered trunk marked with Hargrave's initials. Inside, a journal. Holmes opened it, flipping rapidly through its pages. Drawings, notes, fragments in Hargrave's looping, restless hand. He stopped at a page near the center and read aloud, "When the light completes the circle, the self may dissolve. Not death, but departure. Edited, the world cannot contain the art. The artist must leave it. This is the final shape." Holmes closed the book slowly. "It was never a vanishing," he said. "It was a surrender." I frowned. "You mean he took his own life?" Holmes shook his head. "No, he gave it away, piece by piece, to the ritual, to Langford, to the pavilion, until there was nothing left to take." A heavy silence fell. Saito stepped forward. "Then Hargrave is gone," Holmes said softly. "By choice. but not in body. He turned the journal and held up a pressed scrap of cloth. It bore a fingerprint. Saito looked closely and nodded. This was stamped at the embassy security gate 2 days before the disappearance. It was used as verification for access, but this fingerprint, it's not Hargrave's. It's too short, too narrow. Holmes closed the journal. Langford forged the signature of disappearance, he said. But the final act, the true act, was played by someone else. He turned to us, and I believe they are still here. Outside, the wind picked up again. The 9 lanterns began to sway. This time not randomly, but as if answering some silent rhythm. Holmes looked toward the pavilion's west wing, where Miss Enfield had just stepped into view beneath the colonnade, clutching a folder to her chest. He watched her for a long moment, then, "Watson, prepare yourself. The next step will not be deduction. It will be confession." Chapter 11. The Bait. Holmes's Grand Strategy. The western colonnade was bathed in amber light as we crossed the pavilion courtyard toward Miss Enfield. She stood still as a statue, the folder still pressed against her chest, though she clearly saw us approaching. Her eyes, large, dark, and trembling, fixed on Holmes with the look of someone who knows she is about to be seen for the first time. "I was just returning this," she said quickly, lifting the folder as if it might shield her from what followed. "It's a catalogue of the ink formulas Hargrave requested. Nothing unusual." Holmes nodded, unbothered. "And I thank you for it, Miss Enfield. But it is not the formulas that interest me. It's the hands that delivered them." He gestured toward the pavilion doors. "Will you walk with us?" She hesitated, then gave the smallest of nods. We walked in silence through the inner corridor until Holmes led us to the octagonal gallery, a quiet chamber rarely visited by staff. Its domed ceiling carried the image of a pale moon, ringed by cloud and cranes in flight. The room was empty, save for a single bench in the center. Holmes gestured for her to sit. She obeyed slowly. "I believe," he said, "that you and Hargrave shared more than scrolls." Her fingers tightened on the folder. "He was kind to me." "Yes," Holmes said gently. "And you to him?" He began to pace the edges of the room, voice calm, even casual. "It is difficult to love a man who cannot love you back in the ordinary sense, especially when his passions lie elsewhere. Not in people, but in symbols. Not in touch, but in transcendence. And yet, you stayed." She said nothing. "You understood him," Holmes continued. "Not as Langford did, not as an object of study or a threat to tradition, but as a man trying to turn his soul into art. And when he decided to disappear, you helped him." At that, her mouth opened slightly, but no words came. "You carried the final lantern," Holmes said. "Not Langford. You've placed it at the garden center beneath the moon. You knew the pattern. He showed you the sketch." A tremble passed through her. He wanted to vanish. Holmes said, now softer, "And he wanted to leave something behind. Not just the lanterns, but someone who would understand, someone who would keep the story whole." She looked at him now, eyes filling. "I didn't light it," she whispered. "That was Langford. He found the journal and took it as his own. I never meant for him to claim it." Holmes nodded. Of course not." She clutched the folder tighter. Hargrave didn't want fame. He didn't want credit. He wanted silence. He said the world talked too much and listened too little, that his work wasn't meant to be looked at. It was meant to be entered. Holmes stepped closer. "Where is he?" Miss Enfield's lips parted and then closed again. Holmes waited. Finally, she stood, reached into her sleeve, and from it drew a narrow brass key. "He's beneath the pavilion," she said. "The storage tunnels. He built a chamber. I helped him seal it, not to trap, but to protect. It's hidden behind the old rice paper archive room." I felt a chill run down my spine. "You sealed him inside." "He asked me to," she said. "He said if anyone ever came looking, they would have to see with silence, not with noise." Holmes turned to me. "Watson, alert Saito. Tell him we need guards at the west stairs and a medic, but quietly. I suspect the man we seek is alive, though perhaps not entirely well." I hurried from the room, heart pounding. When I returned, a few moments later with Saito and 2 constables, Holmes and Miss Enfield were already leading the way into the pavilion's rear service wing. A maze of long unused rooms and hidden doors. We descended a narrow stair, passed through a supply chamber, and at last stopped at what appeared to be a blank panel in the wall. Miss Enfield pressed the key into a knot in the wainscoting. A quiet click. The panel swung inward. We stepped into shadow. The chamber was small, circular, and lined with white rice paper, hand-painted with circles, arcs and brush characters that pulsed with layered meaning. At the center sat a man cross-legged on a cushion, eyes closed, breathing shallowly. Edmund Hargrave. Alive. His beard was longer, his frame thinner, but it was him. The artist opened his eyes slowly as Holmes stepped forward. "You've come at the right time," Hargrave said softly. "The cycle is almost complete." Holmes crouched. "The world believes you're dead." "I am," Hargrave replied, smiling faintly. "The part of me that belonged to the noise. What remains now belongs to the lanterns." Holmes said nothing. Hargrave looked past him at Miss Enfield, who stood silently at the threshold. "She kept her promise," he said. "She always understood." Holmes reached out a hand. "Come with us." Hargrave hesitated. Then, finally, he rose. Outside, the first of the lanterns caught the morning breeze and turned slowly, spilling faint light across the garden as dawn approached. Chapter 12. The Moment of Recognition. The light of dawn filtered through the high pavilion windows as Holmes and I helped Edmund Hargrave ascend the narrow servant stairwell. He walked unsteadily, one hand trailing along the wall for balance, his breathing shallow but rhythmic. He did not speak much, only offering short answers, half smiles and brief glances at the corridors, as though returning to a world half forgotten. Miss Enfield remained a few steps behind, her hands clasped, gaze lowered. I could not tell whether her silence was sorrow or relief. At the top of the stair, we emerged into the east wing. The building, hushed from the night's strange events, seemed to hold its breath as Hargrave paused near the studio door. He looked, and everything remained as he had left it. The ink bowls, the unfinished brush lines, the crescent of lantern stands. But it was the blank canvas by the far wall that drew his gaze. Holmes stepped beside him. The last one was never painted. No, Hargrave murmured. It wasn't meant to be. The lanterns were the brushstrokes, the pavilion, the canvas, the cycle was the art. Holmes studied him a moment longer, then gestured gently for him to sit. A chair was drawn. Tea was brought. Holmes said nothing at first. He let the silence settle like dust. Then, tell me, Mr. Hargrave, what did you hope to find on the other side of vanishing? Hargrave didn't look up. Peace, not from people, but from the need to be seen. I was tired of interpretation, tired of being named before I finished speaking. Watson and I exchanged a glance. Holmes remained still. You did not disappear out of fear. Holmes said, you disappeared out of design. But someone misread your design. Langford twisted it. Enfield preserved it. And the pavilion inherited it. Hargrave nodded. I gave Langford the scrolls, he said. The cycles. I thought he understood. But he became obsessed with correcting it, refining it. He made it into a ritual, I said. He made it into a punishment. Hargrave replied. He believed the 10th lantern would condemn the false fusion of East and West. I wanted to honor both. He wanted to erase me. Holmes looked thoughtful. You knew Langford would interfere. I suspected. Then why entrust him with the pattern? Because the pattern had to survive me. The artist cannot hold the art, not forever. Holmes sat forward slightly. Then you knew someone would finish it. Hargrave nodded. But I never expected her. He looked at Miss Enfield. She was quiet, always watching. I never had to explain myself to her. She said nothing, but the weight of that gaze lingered like a final brushstroke. Holmes stood. There's still one piece left, he said, the moment the pattern turned. He walked to the scroll cabinet and withdrew a single document. The one with the ink fingerprint. The phrase, the 10th must not be lit before the moon watches. Holmes held it up. This, he said, was not your hand. Hargrave looked at it, and his brow furrowed. No, he said after a moment. It's Langford's brushstroke, but it was copied from my journal. Holmes turned the paper over. There's a crease here, he said. 2 folds, as though it was placed inside something. Not a book, but a lantern. He opened the hay cabinet further and withdrew the white lantern. The keystone, now extinguished and fragile in the morning light. From within, he produced a scrap of parchment. Identical folds, matching soot stain. The final instruction, Holmes said softly, placed not to complete the ritual, but to delay it, to slow Langford, to give you time. Hargrave nodded slowly. I wasn't ready. I needed more time to disappear, not physically, but within. Holmes folded the paper. You nearly succeeded. Then, in a shift I barely perceived, his expression changed. But you didn't intend to vanish forever. Hargrave looked up. Holmes continued. You left the 9th lantern visible from the rooftop. You arranged the pattern but left the 10th hidden. You wanted to be found, not by the world, but by one person. His eyes turned to Miss Enfield. She looked away, trembling. Holmes stepped back. Watson, he said, the moment of recognition has passed. I frowned. What do you mean? He tapped the white lantern. This was never a crime. It was A misread message, theft mistaken for performance, a disappearance mistaken for death. But now the circle closes, and the artist returns. He turned to Saito, who had joined us in the doorway. "There is no charge here," Holmes said. "Only misinterpretation." Saito nodded once, and just like that, the spell lifted. Miss Enfield walked to Hargrave's side and placed a hand gently on his arm. He looked up at her and smiled, softly, not with triumph, but with recognition. Outside, the lanterns still hung in silence. Holmes watched them from the window. "You were right, Hargrave," he said quietly. "There is too much noise in the world, but sometimes a single silence is enough to be heard." Chapter 13. The Final Attempt to Escape. The quiet that settled over the pavilion in the wake of Hargrave's return felt fragile, like a thin crust of ice above a slow-moving current. Though the lanterns remained unlit and the guests and staff had resumed their hushed routines, I could not shake the feeling that the story had not quite ended. Holmes, for his part, said little. That afternoon, he requested that Hargrave and Miss Enfield remain within the East Wing under gentle supervision. A physician was called to examine the artist, who submitted willingly to observation and rest. Saito, ever dutiful, agreed to handle all public statements regarding Hargrave's return from seclusion, carefully avoiding words like ritual or disappearance. The press, thankfully, had not yet caught wind of the affair. All seemed settled until the message arrived. It was slipped beneath the door of Holmes's temporary study, a single sheet of vellum folded in half, sealed with a smear of crimson wax. No insignia, no mark. Holmes opened it in silence. I leaned over his shoulder as he read. There were only 4 words written in broad, hurried ink. "One light still burns." Holmes stared at the words for a long time. Then he stood. "It's not over." I looked up. "Langford's in custody." "Yes," Holmes replied, but not silent. He crossed the room, opened the lacquered cabinet, and withdrew a folded map of the pavilion grounds. Spreading it out across the table, he pointed to a section marked Old Conservatory, a glass-domed annex long since closed for repairs. I asked Durant to keep Langford under guard in the magistrate's quarters. Holmes said, but if he passed this note, he had help or leverage. He turned to me sharply. "Watson, do you recall the detail Langford mentioned during our first meeting?" I frowned. He said Hargrave misunderstood the symbology, blurred the sacred with the decorative. Holmes nodded, and he referenced the Ryugu-jo cycle, the dragon palace beneath the sea. But he did more than study it. He replicated it. I stared at him. "You think he set a final trap?" "I think," Holmes said, "Langford believes the ritual is incomplete and means to complete it his way." He gestured. "Come, we're going to the conservatory." Twilight had just begun to touch the sky with violet as we arrived at the old conservatory. It stood quiet and shadowed, its glass panes mottled with dust and ivy, long disused since the renovations had halted due to lack of funds. A faded iron sign hung askew on the door. No entry, fragile structure. Holmes ignored it. The door creaked, open with a reluctant groan. Inside, the conservatory was cloaked in cool gloom, air thick with the scent of decaying earth and dry foliage. Faint shafts of light cut through the grime-streaked glass above, illuminating tables still scattered with broken pots and rusted tools. And at the center, suspended from a beam overhead, was the 10th lantern. Not the white one we had recovered, a different one. Painted in crimson and black, flames and waves intertwined in violent spirals. Beneath it, a small pile of wood and paper had been arranged in the shape of a coiled dragon. A box of matches sat nearby. Holmes approached, gaze wary. Langford's final performance. "You believe he built this after Hargrave disappeared?" I asked. "Yes," Holmes said, "as his own ending, a counter-ritual, one not of transcendence, but of destruction." He knelt, examined the lantern's underside. "See here, soaked with oil, laced with fine powder." "A firebomb," I breathed. Holmes nodded grimly. "Designed to ignite quickly, perhaps even to scatter embers. If lit beneath the pavilion's western dome, it might have burned half the structure before fire crews arrived." "But why now?" "Because Langford knew he had lost the narrative. Hargrave was found. The lanterns were not lit. The pavilion would survive. This," he gestured around the room, "was his last attempt to claim authorship. If he could not control the ending, he would end it." I swallowed. "But who brought the note?" Holmes stood. "I believe," he said, "Langford had a collaborator. Someone who believed in the ritual, not for ideology but for attention, for spectacle." He turned to the door. "Miss Voss." We returned to the East Wing at once. Otto High Constable informed us that Miss Voss had not been seen for nearly an hour. Her belongings, brushes, satchel, scarf, were missing from the gallery bench where she often worked. Holmes moved with swift efficiency. He summoned Saito and Durant, gave orders to seal the pavilion's western stair and lock access to all rooftop levels. Within minutes, the staff had fanned out to search. Then, amid the sudden flurry of footsteps and voices, Holmes stood still. He listened and smiled faintly. "Smoke," he said. "Coming from below." He ran. I followed close behind as he descended the narrow stair that led to the pavilion's wine cellar, an area rarely accessed and still under repair. As we reached the bottom, we found the door ajar, and inside, Miss Voss. She crouched beside a small lantern, lit and burning low. Around her, faint wisps of smoke curled toward the ceiling. She looked up at us with wide, fevered eyes. "You don't understand," she said, voice cracking. "The ritual was incomplete. Langford tried to overwrite it. I was just restoring the balance." Holmes said nothing at first. Then he stepped forward and snuffed the flame with a single motion. "You mistook fire for light," he said, "and silence for permission." She didn't resist as the constables took her away. Outside, the wind had picked up once more. The lanterns along the pavilion's garden walk swayed gently, as though breathing in rhythm with the world again. Holmes and I stood by the reflecting pool, watching their soft, unlit forms ripple in the dusk. "She believed in it," I said. "The story, the ritual." Holmes nodded. "But she misunderstood the artist's intent. Hargrave sought disappearance, not spectacle. Langford turned it into ideology, Voss into myth." He looked up, and in the end, Watson, no one heard the silence. Chapter 14. Holmes closes in. The final clue revealed. It was past midnight when Holmes and I returned to our rooms in the pavilion's guest quarters. Outside, the garden had quieted again. The wind had calmed, and the paper lanterns no longer swayed but hung still, silent figures bearing no light, no flame, only memory. Holmes did not remove his coat. He paced the room like a man still caught between thought and movement, his fingers twitching near his lapels. At length, he stopped before the hearth, where the faint embers of the evening fire glowed dimly. "It is nearly complete," he said. "What is?" I asked. "The shape of it," he replied, "the design behind it all. But there remains one fragment unspoken, one final thread waiting to be drawn." He turned to me, and his voice took on its calm, analytical cadence. The voice I knew from 100 drawing-room revelations and drawing pins on maps. "We must begin," he said, "with the premise that Hargrave did not disappear. He performed disappearance, a vanishing act staged with such elegance that even those closest to him mistook it for a cry for help, or a ritual." I nodded slowly. "You've said as much." Langford, on the other hand, twisted that performance into dogma. He read the brushstrokes as prophecy, Voss as myth. Each sought authorship over a story they did not write. And that, Watson, is where the final clue hides. Not in the lanterns, not in the scrolls, but in ownership. He crossed to the desk and withdrew. The journal we had recovered from the hidden chamber, Hargrave's personal log, filled with erratic symbols, sketches, and philosophical notes. Holmes flipped to the final page. "Look here," he said. I leaned in. At the bottom corner of the last written page, in pale ink, were 4 brush strokes, so faint they could easily be mistaken for decoration. But Holmes tapped them one by one. Dragon's breath, coiled wind, moon's descent, flame's eye, he said. 4 symbols, 4 clues, not merely artistic flourishes, but instructions. He closed the book, then walked to the window and pointed to the 9 lanterns strung along the reflecting pool. "Each lantern matches one of the symbols," he said. "The red dragon, the crescent moon, the wave, the eye, and each placed with intention, leading the eye toward the center." "The 10th, I said. Holmes nodded. "But not the white lantern we recovered. That was a decoy, a placeholder. The true 10th lantern was the red-black one in the conservatory, Langford's weapon." I stiffened. "You mean he replaced the final lantern?" Holmes looked at me. "Yes. He hijacked Hargrave's final symbol. A lantern meant to remain unlit, the flame's eye closed in peace, twisted into a bomb. His own ideological signature, hidden behind the artist's brush." He turned back toward the fire. "Langford planned it long before the disappearance. Hargrave entrusted him with the journals, the patterns. He saw them not as invitation, but as weakness. He believed Hargrave was confused, not creative. And so he built his own conclusion." Holmes tapped the fire grate lightly with his cane. "But Miss Voss saw it first. She saw Langford's corruption of the ritual and believed she had to restore it. But her interpretation was no clearer. She turned silence into a summons, an ending into an awakening." I exhaled. "So they all misunderstood him?" "Yes," Holmes said, "because Hargrave did not want immortality. He wanted erasure, not martyrdom, not legacy, but peace." He stepped away from the fire and approached the lacquered trunk. where we had stored the extinguished white lantern. Lifting it from its wrappings, he turned it gently, revealing the bottom ridge. "See here," he said, "a hidden seal." With the tip of his knife, he loosened the delicate edge of the base, and it slid open like a secret drawer. Inside was a single, folded parchment. Holmes withdrew it and held it to the light. The ink was faint, but the brush strokes were unmistakable. A circle, a rising sun, and a final symbol, a closed eye within a lantern. Underneath was one line: "To end without applause is the purest form of art." Holmes said nothing. He folded the paper and placed it back in the lantern. "That," he said, "was the final clue." I stared at him. "So what now?" Holmes looked at me with something between serenity and sorrow. "Now," he said, "we let the curtain fall." That morning, Holmes asked that the lanterns be taken down and packed carefully into storage, not for display, but for preservation. He left instructions that no ceremony was to be held, no statements made to the public, no narrative offered beyond this. The artist has returned. The work is complete. Miss Enfield offered no protest, nor did Hargrave. Langford would face formal charges. Miss Foss would be released into medical care. And the pavilion, its breath finally steady, would begin again. On our final evening in Brighton, Holmes and I took one last walk through the garden where the lanterns had hung. The cords were gone, the posts removed. Only faint circles of pressed grass remained where they had once swayed. Holmes stopped and looked up at the empty air. "Strange," he murmured. "The absence speaks louder than the symbol." "Do you regret taking the case?" I asked. He turned to me with a tired smile. "Regret? No, but I will not soon forget it." He paused. "This was a different sort of mystery, Watson. Not about motive, not even about guilt. It was about meaning. And meaning, as we've seen, is the most dangerous illusion of all." He glanced toward the sky, where the moon had begun to rise once more, pale and quiet. "Still," he added, "some illusions are worth chasing." We walked on. Chapter 15. The Final Gathering. The following evening, as the pavilion's lamps flickered awake one by one, and the air took on that particular stillness, found only in the moments before a revelation, Holmes made his final request. Would like everyone involved, he told Mr. Sato, assembled in the main chamber of the octagonal gallery at precisely 8 o'clock this evening. No exceptions. Saito, who by now had learned to question Holmes only rarely, nodded without hesitation. And so, under the glass dome with its painted moon and circling cranes, 7 figures gathered. To one side sat Edmund Hargrave, dressed in clean linen, his hair combed, his frame still thin, but his eyes no longer distant. Beside him, hands folded in her lap, was Miss Willow Enfield, her expression unreadable but attentive. Across from them, Miss Althea Voss sat with her arms loosely crossed, her expression caught somewhere between defiance and fatigue. A constable stood quietly near the gallery's entrance, where Professor Langford, now stripped of his professorial vestments and dressed in neutral grey, was seated under guard. His jaw remained clenched, though a flicker of disdain still danced behind his eyes. Inspector Durant had been granted a chair opposite Holmes, ostensibly to maintain order, though in truth It was Holmes who commanded the room. I, of course, took my place beside him, notebook in hand. Holmes remained standing. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone mild, "we are gathered not for prosecution, but for illumination. A mystery was woven around this pavilion. Its symbols, its lanterns, its people. What began as a disappearance became a legend. What was thought to be an escape became a ritual. And what passed for reverence became obsession." He let the silence settle. "I have pieced together the story, but it would not be proper to explain it alone. Let each player, then, see their place in the pattern." He turned first to Hargrave. "You created the lanterns to disappear. Not your body, but yourself. You sought to leave behind not a message, but an absence, a silence." Hargrave inclined his head once. Holmes turned to Langford. "You misunderstood that silence. You believed it spoke of corruption, of broken cultural boundaries. You twisted the artist's retreat into a crusade. Your aim was not to find him, but to erase what he represented." Langford's lip curled, but he said nothing. "Even then," Holmes continued, "you required help." He gestured to Voss. "Miss Voss, you saw Langford's misappropriation as a threat. You responded with your own symbolic counter, attempting to light what you believed was the true flame, the original ritual. But your belief was no less dangerous. You turned an ending into an awakening." Voss's gaze did not leave his, but her arms slowly uncrossed. Holmes then looked to Miss Enfield. "And you, Miss Enfield, you alone understood what Hargrave meant to do. You did not interfere. You did not interpret. You preserved. That is why he entrusted you with the key." Her eyes welled, but she said nothing. Holmes began to pace. "The 10th lantern, the real one, was never meant to be lit. Its purpose was symbolic. A sealed eye, a closed circle. Hargrave wished the audience to know the story was over without needing to witness its final act. But when the other players took control of the stage, that final act became a contest. Langford built a firebomb. Voss lit a substitute. And all the while, the truth sat in silence beneath the pavilion." Chertoff returned to the center of the room. "It is not a criminal court I hold here tonight, but a mirror. What each of you chose to believe about art, about ritual, about control, has been exposed." Holmes folded his hands behind his back and looked to Durant. "There is one final matter. Professor Langford's sabotage of the conservatory lantern. He altered a cultural artifact with the intention to harm. His actions, though cloaked in theory, were physical, deliberate, and nearly catastrophic." Durant gave a tight nod. "He will stand trial." Holmes then turned to Voss. Miss Voss acted out of misguided devotion, not malice. Her role I leave to the discretion of Mr. Sato and the Pavilion Committee." Voss looked away. I could not read her expression. "And Hargrave?" I asked. Holmes smiled faintly. "Needs rest, not judgment." A longer silence passed. Then Holmes bowed his head slightly. "There will be no encore. The performance is concluded." The gathering dissolved, quietly, one by one. The guests left the room. Langford was taken under guard. Voss walked alone into the moonlit corridor. Enfield returned to Hargrave's side, guiding him gently towards the East Book. Holmes remained still at the center of the octagon. "You never told them everything," I said. "No," he replied, "because stories are not about telling everything, Watson. They are about revealing enough." He looked up. I let out a slow breath. "And what now?" Holmes sat back. "Langford will be tried. Voss has been referred for psychological treatment. Hargrave is not to be questioned. His work and its meaning belong now to the archives, not the galleries." He picked up the white lantern one final time, examining its fragile surface in the morning light. "I shall recommend," he said, "that the pavilion place no plaque, no exhibit, no explanation. Only the lantern itself, unlit, behind glass. Let others wonder, let others listen." He stood folding his hands behind his back. "There are some stories, Watson, that must not be told, only found." We remained there in silence for a while, watching the shadows shift across the lacquered floor as the sun climbed higher. And somewhere, not far off, a single petal drifted down from the pavilion's cherry tree and came to rest beside Holmes's boot. Chapter 17. Outcome and Justice. It was a week before we left Brighton, though the case, if it can be called such, had ended long before our departure. Justice, that curious blend of process and perception, had begun its inevitable crawl, and though Holmes had provided no formal testimony, his influence was unmistakable. Professor Langford, for all his intellect and conviction, had proven remarkably fragile under the steady hand of interrogation. Stripped of the cloak of authority and cut off from the rarefied air of academia, he quickly fell into contradiction. The charges brought against him, attempted arson, endangerment of public property, and tampering with cultural artifacts, were enough to ensure he would not soon lecture again. Scotland Yard, ever eager to maintain appearances, moved swiftly, yet Holmes, true to form, spoke not once in court. He wanted to destroy something he couldn't understand. Holmes said to me over breakfast, "That is not criminal in itself." But his method was. Fortunately, the fire never came. Miss Althea Voss, too, was called to account, though the law was more forgiving. Her attempt to rekindle the lanterns, though reckless, had not caused material harm. Her motivations, as Holmes had so gently described, were born of belief, not malice. At Holmes's urging, Saito petitioned for leniency. Voss was released into the care of a quiet sanatorium in the South Downs, a place Holmes assured me was more monastery than prison. "She sought balance," he said one afternoon, and when the artist fell silent, she tried to hold the echo. "That is not evil, it is human." As for Miss Enfield, she resumed her duties in the Pavilion Library, though with quieter hours and far fewer visitors. Her face no longer wore the apprehension of concealment, but rather the stillness of someone who had kept a promise that mattered. She spoke little, even when we crossed paths on our final day. But when Holmes handed her a small sealed envelope and said simply, "It is not for publication," she nodded solemnly and placed it inside the drawer beside her archive ledger. Its contents, I never asked. I did not need to. Edmund Hargrave, for his part, remained in the pavilion guest quarters until the end of the festival season. No statement was ever released regarding his disappearance. The pavilion directors, likely nudged by Saito's discretion and Holmes's influence, issued only this to the local press. Mr. Hargrave's artistic process required seclusion. He is now at rest, and his work has concluded. No more was said. The lanterns were placed into storage, not with labels or fanfare, but with reverence. The 10th remained unlit, preserved exactly as Holmes found it, its pale surface marked by a single crimson thread tied around the upper ring. That, I was told, was Enfield's doing. One final thread, uncut. On our final night, Holmes and I stood beneath the pavilion's eastern colonnade, watching the sea of empty lawns where the lanterns had once danced. The moon was low, a soft yellow coin pressed against the horizon. A breeze swept through the garden, rustling the cherry trees like whispered applause at the close of a quiet play. "You knew from the beginning," I said, "that Hargrave wasn't dead." Holmes tilted his head. "I knew only that the scene was too elegant for murder." He lit a cigarette, the smoke curling upward in slow spirals. "This one began with a lantern, but it ends with a shadow." Chapter 16. The reveal. Holmes breaks down. The crime? It was the morning after the final gathering. The pavilion had returned to its languid rhythm. Gardeners pruning rose hedges, porters carrying folded draperies, and the soft murmur of guests lingering at breakfast under parasols. But in the cool stillness of the drawing room, Sherlock Holmes was readying his conclusion. The fire had burned low. Light filtered in from the high windows, casting dappled shadows across the lacquered table where Holmes had laid out the physical remains of the case. Hargrave's journal, the 10th lantern, fragments of pigment-stained parchment, and the folded note found beneath the atrium door. I sat opposite him, pen in hand. Holmes, ever composed, leaned back slightly in his chair, fingertips pressed together beneath his chin. "Well, Watson," he said, "as is often the case, the simplest truths were concealed behind the loudest symbols." He gestured to the lantern. "This object, believed by Langford to be sacred, by Voss to be redemptive, and by the pavilion to be ceremonial, was none of those things. It was a veil. A final gesture by an artist who wished to conclude without spectacle. The unlit flame, the closed eye, the hidden scroll, each was a deliberate choice to withhold. And yet, I said, it triggered a storm of interpretations. "Precisely," Holmes replied, "because when the artist withdrew, he left a vacuum, and vacuums are rarely left unfilled." He turned toward the journal. "Let us begin with Hargrave. A man of reclusive temperament, prone to spiritual abstraction, but not mad. He saw the commission of the lanterns not merely as an artistic endeavor, but as a philosophical one, a way to explore erasure, anonymity, and silence." Holmes flipped open the journal. Here is where the mistake began. He allowed others, Langford, Voss, even Enfield, to read his notes. And in doing so, he permitted their projections to infiltrate his work. Langford, who saw cultural dilution. Voss, who saw cosmic balance. Enfield, who saw the man himself. I frowned. Was that a mistake on her part? No, Holmes said quietly. She did what Hargrave could not. She respected the silence. He continued, when Hargrave disappeared into the sealed chamber beneath the pavilion, he did so believing his art would end there. The final lantern, sealed not to be lit, was meant to suggest finality. The end of the pattern. The eye closed. He tapped the soot-smudged kanji, from inside the lantern. Fire, in his symbology, was not destruction. It was illumination. The lanterns were not funerary objects. They were brushstrokes in negative space. Holmes leaned forward now, voice sharpening. But Langford, our cultural advisor and failed gatekeeper, believed Hargrave's work was dangerous. He viewed it as sacrilege. And so, when Hargrave vanished, Langford stepped in. He staged the return of the 9 lanterns and secretly forged the 10th, not the white, peaceful vessel, but a red-black counterpart soaked in oil and powder. His plan was not completion. It was retribution. I nodded slowly. The conservatory. Yes, Langford intended to ignite the final lantern beneath the pavilion's western dome. Not only would it have created a fire, it would have cast doubt upon Hargrave's entire oeuvre. He wanted the artist's legacy to collapse in disgrace. And Voss? Ah, Holmes said. Miss Voss believed herself a protector. She suspected Langford's intentions, perhaps even discovered the journal was missing pages. But she, too, misunderstood Hargrave. She saw the lanterns as cosmic markers and tried to light them in sequence. Her actions nearly accelerated Langford's sabotage. He paused, lifting the folded vellum message. One light still burns. This, however, was the key. It was Langford's final gambit, a call to action, not to the pavilion or the public, but to Voss. A whisper that the story was not yet concluded. He set the paper down. And then there is Miss Enfield. He looked at me. She alone held no motive but preservation. When Hargrave confided in her, he did so not with instruction, but with trust. She sealed him away with the lantern and said nothing. Even when the noise rose around her, she remained silent. That, Watson, is why he emerged, because she preserved the ritual, not with fire, but with stillness. There was no panic, no forced entry, no errant detail. Only symbols, precise, deliberate. Hargrave wanted to vanish on his terms. The others tried to hijack that story. But stories resist captivity. I looked toward the pavilion's long windows, their glass glowing faintly from within. Did you ever consider stopping him, bringing him back forcibly? Holmes took a long breath. No. Why not? He glanced at me, something gentler in his expression than usual, because not all disappearances are losses, Watson. Some are choices, and some are the only peace a man can find. We stood there in silence for a time, each lost in our own thoughts. Then Holmes crushed the cigarette beneath his heel, turned and said, "We leave at dawn. I've had enough paper lanterns for one lifetime." I smiled. No interest in next year's festival then. He looked at me sidelong. Only if they promised not to involve dragons, moon rituals, or ghosts, or artists. Holmes raised an eyebrow. Especially artists. And so we departed. As the train pulled away from Brighton Station, I glanced back once through the carriage window. The pavilion's domes were just visible in the distance, hazed in morning mist. It looked from that vantage less like a building and more like a dream someone had left behind. A structure made not of stone or plaster, but of story. And story, as Holmes had taught me, is the most enduring form of mystery. Chapter 18. Holmes's Final Reflection. It was several days after our return to Baker Street when I found Holmes at the window, his violin resting untouched beside him, his gaze fixed on the traffic below, as though the city itself were attempting to whisper a riddle only he could interpret. He had spoken little of Brighton since our departure, answering questions only when pressed and changing the subject often, with a disinterested wave of the hand. Yet I sensed the case had not quite released its hold on him. That afternoon, as the rain tapped lightly against the window panes and the fire burned low in the grate, I set down my pen and asked directly. "Holmes," I said, "did the case end as you expected?" He did not turn from the window. "No case ends as one expects, Watson. That is why we take them." I leaned forward. "But did it end rightly?" He considered that a moment. "Rightly for who?" "For Hargrave, for Enfield, for the pavilion." Holmes reached for his pipe, struck a match, and answered slowly. "Hargrave chose silence. Enfield preserved it. Langford tried to overwrite it. Voss tried to reimagine it. The pavilion tried to display it. And the world tried to explain it, exhaled a thin plume of smoke. But in the end, Watson, the silence remained. I smiled faintly. "And what of you?" He glanced at me, and for a rare moment the great detective seemed smaller, more man than myth. "I merely observed," he said, "yet I knew better. I knew that Holmes had, with deliberate precision, pulled each thread of meaning from the tapestry and laid it bare, only to choose, in the final act, not to speak it aloud. There had been a moment, unspoken but vivid, in which he could have exposed every flaw, every misstep, every trembling deception in that strange, lantern-lit mystery. But instead, he had allowed the truth to settle like ash, quiet, undisturbed. He had solved the case, yes, but he had left the artist's silence intact. That was not merely restraint. That was mercy. Later that evening, Holmes surprised me by returning to his violin. The notes he played were neither mournful nor jubilant. They drifted through the room like smoke, indistinct, unresolved, the way ink lingers after the words have ended. I watched him for a while, wondering not for the first time whether the pursuit of logic was merely Holmes's method of protecting himself from the quieter questions. Eventually, I asked, "Do you believe Hargrave was right, that the world talks too much and listens too little?" Holmes didn't pause in his playing. "Perhaps," he said, "but I've always believed, Watson, that the truth does not shout. It waits." He drew the bow one final time across the strings, producing a single-held note that faded slowly into silence. "That," he said, setting the violin down, "is the sound Hargrave was chasing." And then he smiled, just barely, as if he too had found something in the silence. In the weeks that followed, no further inquiries came. The newspapers made only passing mention of the Hargrave incident, focusing more on the pavilion's architectural elegance than its hidden dramas. A few columnists attempted to link the artist's retreat to the broader anxieties of the modern world, but none captured the truth. None came close. Only one article, printed in the back pages of a lesser-known cultural journal, caught my eye. It was unsigned and succinct. A 10th lantern was never lit. And perhaps that was the point. Some truths illuminate, others remain unlit so we may understand the dark. I never learned who wrote it, But Holmes, when I read it aloud, gave a single nod. And that, I suppose, was answer enough. As spring turned to summer, and the streets of London once more filled with the bustle of new cases and old mysteries, Holmes resumed his usual rhythm, unravelling the affairs of financiers, aristocrats and jewel thieves with his usual brilliance and detachment. But every so often, when the light fell just so, I would see him pause before the fireplace, eyes distant, and know that his thoughts had returned, not to murder or theft, but to a paper lantern that was never meant to be lit, and to a story that ended not with revelation, but with reverence. For in that story, more than any other, Holmes had done something rare. He had listened, and in doing so, heard what the rest of us had missed. The mystery behind the silence, the truth within the art, the trail of the paper lanterns.